In 1977, in the heart of Chicago, $18 million vanished from a bank that was far from ordinary. This was no ordinary robbery. The funds belonged to a man whose name struck fear into half the underworld and whose influence quietly seeped into institutions meant to uphold the law. The general in charge of the account, General Raymond Cortez, 54, a decorated officer with over 30 years in covert operations and rumored clandestine connections to narcotics networks, had ensured that every conceivable security measure was in place. Cameras lined the corridors, guards rotated in meticulously logged shifts, and the bank's executive vault, a massive steel structure 4 feet by 3 feet, weighing nearly 2 tons, sat in a reinforced office behind 2 layers of doors, each with dual mechanical and electronic locks requiring codes known only to Cortez and his closest aides. Each package of cash inside was wrapped in 20-kilogram bundles, stacked neatly, and accounted for in duplicate ledgers stored separately. Yet, in the dead of night, 2 men, seemingly ordinary but extraordinarily precise, bypassed these layers of security and disappeared into Chicago's fog with the entirety of the fortune. Michael Mick Doran, a former Marine with intimate knowledge of locks and tactical maneuvers, and Luis Herrera, a local fixer with street connections and a knack for timing, had spent months studying the bank's routines. They knew the timing of every guard patrol, the duration of code changes, and the habits of those who could become unexpected witnesses. The bank's architecture, a mid-century fortress of concrete and steel, with an atrium that channeled natural light into the executive offices, worked against them in some ways, but they adapted. They noted the position of floor tiles, the angle of cameras, the sequence of alarms that would trigger if doors were propped open. Cortez's office was meticulously arranged. Walnut furniture, a heavy leather chair, and the imposing safe that seemed immovable. On his desk lay personal effects: a glass of half-drunk scotch, a silver ashtray with smoldering remnants of Cuban cigars, and a small notebook containing code sequences and reminders of transfers. The internal accomplice, a young clerk with access to the vault codes, had been approached months before, subtly coerced and carefully bribed, his financial troubles and ambition exploited. He kept notes in a personal journal, often pausing to question the morality of his choices, muttering under his breath, "Just a few nights more, then I'm out. No one gets hurt. It's just numbers, just numbers." The night of the heist, every routine was observed and timed. 2:12. The night guard began his patrol of the East Corridor. 2:27. The electronic code was entered remotely using a device Mick had constructed to simulate authorized signals. 2:31. The safe swung open with the soft click of pins disengaging, nearly silent against the backdrop of the hum of the building. Each bundle was lifted carefully, weighed, and swapped into prearranged containers designed to mimic the appearance and weight of the originals, leaving behind an illusion of untouched wealth. Throughout, logs were subtly altered by the internal accomplice, entries rewritten in a careful hand to suggest normal access and minor discrepancies that would go unnoticed for years. Luis Herrera coordinated movements outside, ensuring the van used for extraction was positioned strategically, lights off, engine idling, while the neighborhood remained eerily quiet. A neighbor would later report seeing a nondescript van that night, but it was dismissed by the authorities at the time. Inside the vault, tension was thick. Mick whispered under his breath, 20 more kilos? Keep it steady. Almost done." Every step was choreographed to minimize the risk of noise, to prevent the cameras from catching irregular movement, and to exploit moments when guards' rotations overlapped imperfectly. By 2:45, the bundles had been replaced with decoys, logs completed, and the vault resealed. Not a single sensor had tripped. Cortez would later, in private moments, stare at the empty bundles, muttering to himself, "If anyone knew, the shame." The aftermath was immediate yet invisible. Alarms never sounded, cameras showed only fleeting shadows, and the ledgers recorded normal activity. Investigations began quietly, with detectives noting minor inconsistencies, unusual traffic in the area, and the peculiar involvement of the clerk. Over the years, every lead went cold. Mick and Luis vanished into the urban tapestry of Chicago, their identities obscured, their trail erased by careful planning. Yet, despite the precision, the heist left behind subtle clues, twists that would take years to unravel. A ledger page, scorched in a fireplace and found later in a trash heap. A misfiled photograph of the vault area, inadvertently left in a shipment of office supplies. An anonymous note slipped under the door of a retired officer, pointing cryptically toward the hidden cache. Each twist deepened the mystery, raising questions about complicity, corruption, and the shadowy networks that intertwined legitimate authority with the criminal underworld. For 17 years, the $18 million remained missing, a silent testament to the audacity of two men and the vulnerabilities inherent even in the most fortified systems. By the time the authorities finally traced the fortune, the psychological and procedural echoes of that night had permeated the lives of all involved. Guards retired, still haunted by shadows that never revealed themselves. Clerks who had once facilitated entry lived with the secret gnawing at their conscience. The general, now removed from active service, would recount, in hushed tones to close confidants, the sense of violation, the disbelief that such meticulous safeguards could be bypassed so completely. The heist became a legend whispered in law enforcement circles and criminal underworld alike, a benchmark of planning, audacity, and the enduring consequences of human ambition and moral compromise. B-roll. Wide shot of Chicago skyline at night, close-up of steel vault door, blurred shadows passing under surveillance cameras, stacks of cash being lifted into containers, ledger pages being rewritten by hand. The night air in Chicago carried the faint scent of gasoline and melted asphalt, a lingering reminder of vehicles that had been used, moved, and abandoned, and the quiet echo of footsteps that no one followed. Socially, the city was in flux. Corruption whispered in precincts, fear ran silently through communities, and the trust in institutions wavered. The two men had exploited every weakness, both human and mechanical, highlighting the fragile interface between power, greed, and the illusion of security. Every character faced a personal reckoning. Mick with the tension between loyalty and survival, Luis with the constant calculation of risk versus gain, the clerk with the moral weight of betrayal, and General Cortez with the recognition that absolute control is a myth. Each internal dialogue, each hesitation, each glance carried the weight of decades of secrecy and fear. By the final hours of that night, as the city slept under a foggy sky, the heist had concluded flawlessly from the outside. Yet inside, the psychological terrain was already shifting. Twists unfolded silently. A neighbor had glimpsed a van with unfamiliar markings. A clerk had secretly burned a diary page containing code notes. A previously reliable security camera had malfunctioned for reasons unknown. These small anomalies would eventually coalesce into a trail, but not for another 17 years. And then, in an unassuming alley behind a residential building, an anonymous envelope appeared, its contents cryptic, coordinates and a note reading, "If you want the rest, look where the shadows sleep." This final, unclaimed clue left investigators, even decades later, questioning not just the location of the money, but the broader networks of complicity and corruption, the invisible strings linking authority to crime, and the fragile morality of those who had dared to seize what no one thought could be taken. The story of Chicago's most audacious heist was only beginning, and the consequences of that night rippled quietly through time, shaping the lives of everyone touched by it, leaving questions that demanded answers and secrets that would not rest easily. By the early 1980s, the $18 million stolen from General Raymond Cortez's private vault in Chicago had become more than a legend. It was a phantom that haunted both law enforcement and the criminal underworld, a reminder that even the most fortified systems could be penetrated. The initial investigation, led by local detectives and supported in part by federal agents, had been meticulous but ultimately inconclusive. Every lead had been exhausted. The night guard, whose patrol logs were carefully rewritten by the internal accomplice, had been cleared. Street informants and petty criminals had been questioned repeatedly but revealed nothing. And surveillance footage, partially erased and partially tampered with, offered only fleeting shadows and indistinct shapes. Meanwhile, Michael Mick Doran and Luis Herrera had melted into Chicago's urban fabric. Mick, leveraging his military background, established a low-profile security consulting firm, ostensibly advising businesses on safe design and procedural compliance, all while quietly laundering portions of the stolen cash through shell corporations and offshore accounts. Luis moved more fluidly through the city's underworld, embedding himself as a fixer, arranging transactions and discreetly moving funds for clients who would never question his sources. Their operation was underpinned by precise timing, intelligence gathering, and a deep understanding of human behavior. Their victims, after all, were professionals who trusted systems over instincts. Within months, law enforcement began to suspect insider involvement, but identifying the internal accomplice proved impossible. The clerk, whose financial pressures and ambition had made him vulnerable, lived with the quiet terror of exposure. He changed jobs, relocated within the city, and destroyed any documentation that could link him directly to the heist. But the psychological toll manifested in insomnia, panic attacks, and recurring nightmares. Every night I see the vault swinging open, the cash spilling, the cameras watching. I should have stopped it, he muttered to himself, often pacing the small apartment he rented in the South Side. Meanwhile, General Cortez, now retired from active duty but still managing private interests tied to his network, obsessed over the missing funds. He retained a skeletal team of investigators, former colleagues with both loyalty and fear in equal measure, and instructed them to trace every irregular transaction, interrogate former employees, and monitor anyone who had access to the bank or its surrounding infrastructure. For years, their efforts produced only fragments of leads. A suspicious shipment routed through a trucking company, a fleeting photograph of a van parked near the bank, an intercepted phone call referencing code phrases whose meaning could not be deciphered. Each clue generated more questions than answers, deepening the sense of frustration and helplessness. Chicago itself, during these years, was a city in flux. The socio-political climate was tense. Corruption within police departments was an open secret, political allegiances shifted like sand, and trust in institutions eroded among the populace. The robbery had exposed not just vulnerabilities in physical security, but in the broader system, procedures designed to prevent theft were often circumvented with minimal risk of detection, and the overlap of criminal influence and legitimate authority created a shadow zone where almost anything could occur unnoticed. As the 1980s progressed, federal agencies such as the FBI became involved in the investigation, particularly when intelligence suggested that portions of the stolen funds were being funneled into organized narcotics operations. They employed financial forensics, scrutinizing transactions for anomalies, tracing shell companies, and employing undercover operations to map the network. Yet Mick and Luis anticipated such moves, diversifying accounts, using intermediaries, and creating layers of obfuscation that made it impossible to establish a direct trail. By the mid-1980s, the story of the stolen $18 million had taken on a near-mythical status. Investigators documented multiple twist moments. An envelope containing partial code sequences discovered in a long-forgotten storage locker, a ledger page burned but partially preserved through fire-retardant ink, and a neighbor's recollection of a van bearing false registration plates. Each twist, while tantalizing, led nowhere definitive. Forensic and psychological profiling became crucial tools. Analysts examined the behaviors of Mick, Luis, and the internal accomplice, hypothesizing motivations, stress responses, and possible interactions with law enforcement. Profilers noted patterns consistent with highly disciplined individuals: calculated risk-taking, avoidance of unnecessary contact, and meticulous planning. They predicted that the duo would avoid flamboyant displays of wealth and operate within a narrow, controlled circle, which proved accurate. In parallel, General Cortez wrestled with his conscience and legacy. His public persona remained that of a decorated, disciplined officer. Yet in private he admitted to a persistent unease about the source of the stolen funds and the potential involvement of people he trusted. Entries in his personal journal reveal this internal struggle. "I trained for war, yet the battle comes to me here, inside my own walls. Who can I trust, and who has already betrayed me?" By the late 1980s, technology had begun to shift the investigative landscape. Surveillance systems were improving, and law enforcement began applying emerging computer-assisted analysis to financial records and communications. Investigators revisited old files, comparing handwriting, cross-referencing phone records, and tracking the movement of vehicles that had been logged near the bank in 1977. It was during this renewed scrutiny that minor discrepancies, previously overlooked, began to coalesce into a coherent pattern. A previously dismissed shipping receipt, a misfiled insurance form, and an unusual bank transfer aligned to suggest a hidden network coordinating the dispersal of funds. Still, years passed and tangible results remained elusive. Mick and Luis adapted in response, further fragmenting the assets, moving cash through legitimate businesses, and cultivating a network of intermediaries who were unlikely to be questioned. Their psychological state mirrored the meticulousness of their operations. Constant vigilance, hyper-awareness of threats, and the quiet satisfaction of having outmaneuvered law enforcement and the general's private security for nearly a decade. Twist moments continued to emerge. A retired bank officer recalled unusual access requests. A misplaced ledger page hinted at unrecorded transactions. A discarded piece of correspondence in a municipal archive referenced a vehicle sighting near the bank at an unexpected time. Each revelation reignited investigative efforts, but the distance in time, combined with deliberate obfuscation, meant that certainty remained just out of reach. By the early 1990s, the case was transferred to a specialized task force combining FBI agents, state investigators, and forensic accountants. They employed sophisticated analytical techniques, network mapping of associates, tracking financial flows, and examining anomalies in property records. They began to link seemingly unrelated events, the movement of vehicles, the acquisition of commercial properties, and minor cash deposits, to a potential trail leading back to the heist. The internal accomplice, now aged and more cautious, lived with the ever-present fear of discovery. Psychological evaluations suggested persistent anxiety, hypervigilance, and recurring guilt. He occasionally confided in distant relatives, noting, 17 years and still every night, I see the vault open. I hear the bundles dropping. I see the eyes that watched me take it, even when no one did." Meanwhile, General Cortez, now in semi-retirement, continued to press for answers. He conducted private inquiries, leveraging old contacts and unofficial channels, determined to uncover not only the stolen funds, but also the extent of any institutional complicity. In 1994, 17 years after the heist, a breakthrough occurred. Investigators, reanalyzing the amassed evidence with modern forensic tools, discovered a series of transactions linking several shell corporations to properties and accounts in suburban Chicago. A careful audit revealed an envelope, long misplaced in municipal records, containing handwritten coordinates and cryptic instructions. These led directly to a safe deposit box containing bundles of cash and documents, untouched for nearly 2 decades. The revelation sent shockwaves through law enforcement, the media, and the remaining associates of Mick and Luis. Questions abounded. How had the men maintained the secrecy for so long? What role had corruption and human error played in the delay? And most crucially, who had been complicit, knowingly or unknowingly, in enabling the concealment of such a vast fortune? The recovery of the funds prompted renewed scrutiny of security protocols, institutional oversight, and the delicate interface between power and vulnerability. Interviews with surviving participants revealed layers of fear, complicity, and moral ambiguity. The internal accomplice expressed relief but also enduring shame, while investigators marveled at the sophistication of a crime executed in 1977 yet undetected for 17 years. The psychological toll on all parties remained evident. Law enforcement officers carried the weight of having missed critical clues for decades. The general grappled with the realization that his meticulously controlled environment had been penetrated, and the perpetrators, though long gone, had reshaped the moral landscape for those left behind. Twist moments continued to echo even after the discovery. A ledger found in the deposit box suggested additional, untraced funds. A photograph showed a vehicle in an unexpected location, and a cryptic note implied that even more layers of concealment existed. Each detail reinforced the complexity of the operation, the skill of the perpetrators, and the intricate interplay between human psychology, institutional procedures, and the passage of time. The city of Chicago, by now transformed in appearance and demographics, still carried the invisible scars of the heist. Socially, the story became a cautionary tale, a study of audacity, planning, and the fragile nature of trust within institutions. It highlighted how individuals, motivated by ambition and opportunity, could exploit systemic weaknesses, and how time could both conceal and reveal truth. By the mid-1990s, the narrative of the heist had shifted from unsolved mystery to partially resolved legend, though critical questions remained. The exact roles of all participants, the full path of the stolen funds, and the long-term consequences for those who had interacted with the crime indirectly. For investigators, the case became an exercise in reconstructing human behavior across decades, understanding decision-making under pressure, and tracing the complex interweaving of legitimate and illicit networks. Every document, every ledger, every witness account offered both insight and ambiguity. The rediscovery of the $18 million became a testament to the endurance of evidence, the persistence of human curiosity, and the eventual triumph of methodical investigation over decades of calculated concealment. Yet, as the recovered funds were accounted for, subtle questions lingered. Had all of the money been found? Were there additional caches still hidden, known only to the perpetrators? And perhaps most chillingly, how many opportunities for exploitation, complicity, and moral compromise remained unnoticed in the corridors of power and secrecy? The heist, once a singular event in 1977, had evolved into a living study of risk, planning, and consequence, a reminder that even the most sophisticated systems are vulnerable to the ingenuity of determined individuals, and that time, while it can obscure, ultimately cannot erase the traces of audacity and crime. Every recovered dollar, every discovered ledger, every testimonial from witnesses and participants painted a portrait not just of theft, but of human complexity, the fears, ambitions, and moral compromises that shape lives and history. B-roll. Recovered cash in evidence vault, close-up of ledger pages, archive photos of Chicago streets from 1977, reenacted shadowed figures moving under streetlights, forensic teams analyzing transactions on early computer systems. The long shadow of the robbery extended into institutional practice, prompting changes in security protocols, auditing procedures, and interagency communication. Analysts reflected on the lessons learned. The human element is always the weakest link. Technology can be circumvented, and patience, cunning, and an understanding of procedural psychology can allow individuals to operate beyond the reach of conventional oversight. And so, 17 years after two men had walked away with $18 million from a general's highly guarded vault, the recovery process revealed as much about human ingenuity, institutional vulnerability, and the delicate balance of power and morality as it did about the money itself. The twists of the operation, the misfiled ledgers, the anonymous notes, the hidden safes, continued to challenge investigators, historians, and psychologists alike, reminding everyone involved that crime, once set in motion, creates ripples far beyond its immediate consequences. The narrative of the heist remained unfinished, even as tangible closure approached, leaving a city, its law enforcement, and the public to grapple with the moral, procedural, and psychological fallout of an audacious act that had gone undetected for nearly 2 decades. By the mid-1990s, Chicago had changed. The streets where shadows once masked the movements of Michael Mick, Doran, and Luis Herrera now bustled with traffic. The skyline punctuated by modern glass towers and renovated brick facades. Yet the memory of the 1977 heist, the $18 million stolen from General Raymond Cortez's private vault, still lingered in whispers among law enforcement, journalists, and those few who had witnessed or participated in the crime. The partial recovery of the stolen funds 17 years later had reignited interest, but questions remained. Investigators reopened old files, re-interviewed retired officers, and deployed modern forensic techniques to untangle decades of obfuscation. For Mick and Luis, time had required adaptation. Mick, now middle-aged, had moved operations offshore, creating layers of legitimate businesses to conceal assets. He had a meticulous routine. Mornings spent reviewing corporate ledgers, afternoons consulting on security for small businesses, evenings spent scanning communications for any hint of investigation activity. Luis Herrera had become a quiet fixture in the city's underground economy, leveraging old contacts, maintaining plausible deniability, and continuing to move money discreetly. Both men, however, were haunted not by the threat of capture alone, but by the psychological burden of maintaining secrecy for nearly 2 decades. Their internal monologues reflected a tension between pride and fear. 17 years, and still I wonder, what if someone finds a trace? What if we missed a file, a transfer, a note? Meanwhile, General Cortez, though aged and partially withdrawn from public life, remained obsessed with understanding not only the mechanics of the heist but also the moral failures it had revealed within his own network. Private meetings with former aides and investigators revealed his ongoing concern about institutional integrity and the latent corruption that had allowed the robbery to succeed undetected. In this third phase of the narrative, investigators concentrated on reconstructing the network of transactions that had dispersed the $18 million. Every shell company, property acquisition, bank account, and coded communication was analyzed in painstaking detail. Digital forensics, newly available in the 1990s, allowed for pattern recognition across decades of financial records. Analysts began to link previously disparate events, uncovering the pathways through which funds had circulated internationally. The recovered portions of the money offered clues to the locations of assets still hidden. Twist moments emerged repeatedly. A misfiled ledger hinted at a secondary deposit in a suburban safe deposit box. A photo developed from an old roll of film captured a van in a location previously unreported. A retired accountant recalled a seemingly innocuous transfer that, in context, suggested a deliberate redirection of funds. Investigators pieced together timelines with surgical precision. They established that during the original heist, Mick and Luis had executed their operation in 5-minute increments, each step choreographed to minimize exposure. The guards' patrols were predictable, the electronic codes temporarily neutralized, the bundles of cash substituted with decoy containers to maintain appearances in ledger logs. They now understood the role of the internal accomplice fully. He had been responsible for duplicating journal entries, timing code changes, and providing observational data on guard rotations. His cooperation, though silent for years, became essential in reconstructing the methodical sequence of events. The psychological profiles of the perpetrators were revisited. Mick demonstrated an obsessive focus on procedural control, reflecting his military training, while Luis exhibited a talent for improvisation and negotiation, able to anticipate human behavior in unpredictable environments. Investigators recognized that this combination of traits had allowed the heist to succeed despite layers of security designed to prevent any breach. Socially, the city remained aware of the heist as a touchstone of corruption and audacity. Journalists published retrospectives, comparing the sophistication of the operation with modern security practices. Citizens, particularly those in financial institutions, viewed the case as a warning of the fragility of trust and the human elements that can undermine even the most robust systems. During the recovery operation, several unexpected discoveries added layers of intrigue. Investigators found correspondence in a hidden compartment of an abandoned property, linking Mick and Luis to additional assets not previously accounted for. A ledger fragment revealed the involvement of an unidentified intermediary who may have facilitated transfers internationally. These findings raised questions about the breadth of the criminal network and the potential for still undiscovered accomplices. The internal accomplice, when finally approached, revealed years of concealed information. Obscure bank codes, off-the-books transfers, and procedural irregularities that had allowed the heist to remain invisible. His personal reflections, recounted in interviews and private statements, offered insight into his fear, shame, and rationalizations. "I thought it was temporary. I thought we'd be careful. I never imagined 17 years would pass before anyone noticed." The general, facing the culmination of his long-term investigation, balanced relief with lingering uncertainty. While the bulk of the $18 million had been accounted for, and the primary perpetrators identified in historical records, the shadows of ambiguity persisted. Questions about moral complicity, institutional oversight, and remaining undiscovered funds prompted further scrutiny. Analysts studied the forensic trail, noting that small human errors, misfiled documents, overlooked ledger entries, and unreported anomalies had allowed the heist to persist undetected for so long. These minor lapses, combined with meticulous planning by the thieves, created a perfect storm that challenged assumptions about security, trust, and the predictability of human behavior. The final reconstruction of events detailed the coordination between the two men, the exploitation of procedural vulnerabilities, and the careful management of risk. Every moment, from the entry into the vault to the distribution of cash across multiple hiding places, reflected the interplay of preparation, audacity, and opportunism. The narrative also emphasized the psychological toll on all involved. Law enforcement officers who had pursued leads only to find dead ends, the general who had managed both fear and shame, and the internal accomplice whose life had been dominated by secrecy and guilt. Twist moments persisted even as closure approached. An old photograph revealed a location previously unexamined. A coded message from the 1970s led to an additional deposit box, and the discovery of a discarded ledger hinted at a broader network that had facilitated the laundering of funds. These elements underscored the complexity of the heist and the enduring consequences of human decision-making under pressure. The culmination of Part 3 focused on the final recovery and accounting of assets, combined with reflections on long-term impact. Investigators documented lessons learned, the necessity of continuous oversight, the limits of technological security without human vigilance, and the moral ambiguities faced by those operating within compromised systems. The recovered funds were returned partially to their rightful owners, but the broader implications remained. The heist had exposed vulnerabilities in security, the subtle interplay of criminal and institutional behavior, and the capacity for human ingenuity to circumvent even the most rigorous safeguards. Interviews with surviving participants revealed lingering psychological effects, persistent anxiety, complex guilt, and the moral reckoning that accompanies participation in extraordinary acts of criminality. The story concluded by highlighting the ripples of the heist, changes in institutional procedures, revised security protocols, and enduring fascination by criminologists and law enforcement agencies. While the $18 million had been largely accounted for, the narrative emphasized that the heist was more than a tale of theft. It was a study in planning, human behavior, institutional vulnerability, and the long shadow cast by audacity and moral compromise. Chicago's landscape, both physical and social, bore witness to the consequences, the lessons, and the enduring questions raised by two men who had, for a brief moment, outmaneuvered an entire system and whose actions reverberated across nearly 2 decades of time. The final twist, subtle yet profound, remained. Investigators found a final set of coordinates in an abandoned property, pointing to assets never recovered, leaving a lingering question of what might still be hidden, and underscoring the persistent intersection of human ingenuity, greed, and the elusiveness of complete resolution. B-roll, archival photos of Chicago streets, recovered cash bundles, close-ups of ledgers and notes, reenacted shadows of the perpetrators moving under dim light, investigators analyzing old photographs and maps, interview clips with retired law enforcement and the internal accomplice. The case of the 1977 Chicago heist thus closed with partial recovery, psychological reckonings, and lessons in security, morality, and human behavior. An enduring narrative of audacity, patience, and consequence that would inform generations of law enforcement, criminologists, and those who study the delicate interplay between opportunity and morality in the shadowed corridors of power.